October 8, 1918, the Argonne Forest at dawn. Wet leaves cling to uniforms, and a grey mist hangs low between shattered trees. The ground is torn by shell fire, churned into mud and splintered wood. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the ridgelines, German machine guns chatter in short, murderous bursts. Each crack of fire echoes through the forest like a hammer striking iron. American soldiers press themselves into the earth, waiting for orders that may never come. Among them stands a quiet corporal from Tennessee. His name is Alvin C. York. Only hours later, the battlefield will fall silent around dozens of captured German soldiers, multiple silenced machine gun nests, and a single American whose actions will become one of the most studied and debated episodes in US military history. But in this moment, nothing about York suggests legend. He is not a career soldier. He is not a trained tactician. He is a farmer, a marksman, and a deeply religious man who once struggled with the morality of killing at all. What happened in the Argonne that morning was not the product of reckless heroism. It was the collision of training, necessity, belief and circumstance, shaped by a war that demanded decisive action from ordinary men. To understand how Alvin C. York turned a German machine gun nest into a legendary victory, one must first understand why this moment mattered so much. By the fall of 1918, the First World War had entered its final, brutal phase. The Allied powers launched the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American operation of the war. More than 1 million US soldiers were committed to breaking through one of the strongest German defensive positions on the Western Front. The terrain was unforgiving, dense forest, ravines and fortified ridges ideal for machine gun defense. German doctrine relied heavily on interlocking machine gun fire. These weapons were not simply tactical tools, they were the backbone of German defensive strategy. A single nest could halt an entire advance, pinning down companies and turning open ground into killing zones. Neutralizing them required speed, coordination, and often enormous sacrifice. American soldiers entering the Argonne expected heavy resistance. They expected casualties. What they did not expect was how effectively German machine gun crews could dominate the forest, stopping assaults before they could gain momentum. On October 8, York's unit was ordered to move through a narrow valley and seize key positions behind German lines. The plan relied on surprise. It failed almost immediately. As the Americans advanced, machine gun fire erupted from elevated positions. Men fell. Units became disorganized. Officers were killed or wounded. What was meant to be a flanking maneuver turned into chaos under fire. It was in this moment, when command structure collapsed and retreat seemed inevitable, that York's role changed. York was part of a small group ordered to silence the guns from the rear. As they advanced, they succeeded in surprising several German soldiers. But before the situation could stabilize, German machine gunners on the surrounding heights opened fire. Most of York's detachment was killed or wounded within moments. Suddenly, the mission rested on a handful of survivors and one man with a rifle. York had grown up hunting in the Tennessee hills. He was accustomed to judging distance, wind, and movement instinctively. What he faced in the Argonne was not hunting, but the skills translated. German machine gun crews, exposed as they fired downhill, revealed themselves one by one. York later described how he prioritized targets deliberately, engaging gunners in sequence to prevent them from regrouping. This was not frenzy. It was methodical action under extreme pressure. As German fire slackened, a German officer attempted to rush York with a pistol, followed by several soldiers. York responded with his .45 pistol, engaging them at close range. When resistance broke, German troops began to surrender in groups, confused, disoriented, and suddenly leaderless. By the time the firing ended, York had neutralized multiple machine gun positions and taken more than 130 German prisoners. The numbers astonished Allied command. One man had done what platoons could not. The advance resumed. A critical section of the German line collapsed. The broader offensive moved forward. York did not see himself as a hero. In his own account, he emphasized necessity, not glory. He later stated that he believed God had guided his actions, not to kill indiscriminately, but to end the fight as quickly as possible. This inner conflict is essential to understanding why York's action resonated so powerfully. He had nearly refused service on religious grounds. He believed deeply in the sanctity of life. Yet when confronted with the immediate threat to his comrades, he acted decisively. The transformation was not from pacifist to killer, but from doubt to responsibility. The recurring symbol of York's story is the rifle, not as an instrument of aggression, but as a tool shaped by discipline and restraint. York fired only when necessary. He advanced only when required. The weapon, in his hands, represented the harsh reality of modern war, that survival and moral conviction could coexist, but never comfortably. York's actions were investigated thoroughly. Witnesses were interviewed. German officers confirmed the events. The scale of the capture and the silencing of the machine gun nests could not be dismissed as exaggeration. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, along with decorations from Allied nations. Yet the legend that followed sometimes obscured the truth. York did not seek fame. He resisted attempts to profit from his story. He returned home to a country eager for heroes, uncomfortable with the cost that produced them. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would continue for weeks, claiming tens of thousands of lives. York's action did not end the war, but it saved lives in that valley. It demonstrated how individual resolve, when aligned with training and purpose, could break even the most formidable defenses. The epilogue of York's story lies beyond the battlefield. His life after the war reflected the same tension he faced in the forest, between duty and humility, between recognition and conscience. He remained a symbol not of violence but of responsibility under impossible circumstances. In the end, Alvin C. York's victory was not measured solely in prisoners captured or guns silenced. It was measured in the quiet understanding that heroism is often reluctant, shaped by necessity rather than desire. The forest eventually grew back. The guns fell silent, but the lesson endured that in moments of collapse, when plans fail and fear dominates, ordinary individuals can still alter history through disciplined action and moral resolve. What followed in the days after October 8, 1918, transformed Alvin C. York from a stunned corporal into a national symbol, almost against his will. The US Army did not immediately grasp the full significance of what had occurred in the Argonne. Reports from the front were often confused, exaggerated, or incomplete. But as officers compared testimonies, counted prisoners, and inspected the silenced machine gun positions, the scope of York's action became undeniable. German officers taken prisoner confirmed the account independently. They described how their interlocking machine gun defense, designed to halt entire battalions, had been dismantled from the rear by a single American rifleman supported by a handful of survivors. This confirmation mattered. In a war filled with propaganda and inflated claims, York's actions stood up to scrutiny from both sides. For the American command, the episode offered more than a heroic anecdote. It revealed something essential about the nature of modern warfare. Machine gun defenses, once thought nearly impregnable, could be broken not only by artillery or massed assault, but by initiative, movement, and the ability to adapt under fire. York's calm prioritization of targets, gunners first, officers second, reflected instincts honed long before he wore a uniform, yet refined by military training. This was not luck, it was alignment. York had entered the army deeply conflicted. Raised in rural Tennessee, shaped by evangelical Christianity, he believed killing violated divine law. His initial request for conscientious objector status was denied, but he was not dismissed or mocked. Instead, his superiors engaged him seriously, encouraging reflection rather than coercion. York later recalled a conversation with his commanding officer that framed the war not as aggression, but as defense of others. That exchange did not erase doubt, but it allowed York to reconcile faith with duty. This internal resolution mattered on October 8th. Under fire, York did not freeze or panic. He acted within a moral framework he had already struggled to define. His objective was not destruction, but the end of resistance. Each shot was purposeful, each surrender accepted. The emotional contrast between expectation and reality is crucial here. York expected fear, confusion, perhaps moral collapse. What he experienced instead was clarity. In the chaos of battle, his doubts narrowed into a single imperative: stop the guns that were killing his comrades. The transformation was not ideological in the political sense. York did not emerge from the Argonne with a grand theory of war. He emerged with a deeper sense of responsibility and a heavy burden. In later years, he spoke candidly about the weight of memory, about faces he could not forget, about the tension between gratitude for survival and sorrow for what survival required. When news of York's actions reached the United States, it collided with a nation desperate for meaning. The war had demanded immense sacrifice. Families needed stories that justified loss. York's background, a humble farmer, reluctant warrior, devout Christian, fit a narrative Americans wanted to believe. He became proof that ordinary virtue could meet extraordinary violence without surrendering its soul. Yet York himself resisted that simplification. He declined early opportunities to capitalize on his fame. He returned to Tennessee, married, and tried to resume a quiet life. The rifle that had defined his moment in history did not define his identity. It was a tool used once, under necessity, then set aside. The recurring symbol of the rifle thus carries its full meaning here. In York's hands, it was not a celebration of firepower, but a reminder of restraint. It represented the uncomfortable truth of modern warfare, that even the most principled individuals may be forced to act decisively in moments where inaction is itself a form of harm. York's legacy endures, not because his actions were repeatable, but because they were rare. They occurred at the intersection of training, belief, circumstance, and moral struggle. Remove any one element, and the outcome likely changes. In the final weeks of the First World War, as the Meuse-Argonne offensive ground forward, York's action became a reference point for what individual initiative could still accomplish in an industrial war. It did not negate the importance of artillery, logistics, or mass mobilization, but it reminded commanders that wars are ultimately fought by human beings making decisions under pressure. The epilogue of York's story reaches beyond 1918. In later conflicts, his example would be cited, debated, sometimes mythologized, but stripped of legend, what remains is a sobering lesson. Heroism is rarely sought, never comfortable, and often accompanied by lifelong reflection rather than triumph. In the forest that morning, Alvin C. York did not set out to become a legend. He set out to stop the guns in front of him. History followed. The final meaning of Alvin C. York's action becomes clear only when it is placed against the broader transformation of warfare that defined the First World War. The Argonne Forest was not a place where individual heroism was supposed to matter. It was a battlefield shaped by artillery schedules, machine gun geometry, and attrition measured in thousands. Men were meant to advance, fall, and be replaced. Initiative was often crushed by doctrine. Survival depended more on timing than talent. Yet York's experience revealed a paradox of industrial war. Even within systems designed to reduce soldiers to components, moments still arose where human judgment could alter outcomes. What York faced on October 8th was not simply a German machine gun nest. It was a defensive philosophy that treated firepower as inevitable and resistance as futile. The guns were meant to dominate terrain automatically. They were meant to remove choice. York reintroduced choice by moving, by prioritizing, by refusing to freeze. This was the deeper transformation his action represented. Not the triumph of one man over many, but the reassertion of agency in a war that tried to erase it. The American army would later study the engagement not as legend, but as instruction. Reports emphasized the importance of small unit initiative, decentralized decision-making, and the necessity of training soldiers to act independently when command structures collapsed. These lessons would echo into later conflicts, shaping doctrines that recognized flexibility as a form of strength. York himself remained uneasy with the attention. In the years that followed, he struggled financially, declined political exploitation of his image, and spoke often about the moral cost of his experience. When his story was eventually dramatized, he insisted that it emphasize faith, doubt, and responsibility rather than glory. He did not want to be remembered as a killer. He wanted to be understood as a man who acted when others were in danger. The rifle, the recurring symbol of his story, thus completes its arc here. It begins as a hunting tool, becomes an instrument of survival under fire, and ends as a burden of memory. It represents the uncomfortable truth that modern freedom has often been defended not by those who seek violence, but by those who reluctantly confront it when no other choice remains. York's victory did not end the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It did not shorten the war by weeks or months, but it saved lives in that valley. It allowed an advance to continue, and it left behind a record, verified by witnesses, confirmed by enemies, preserved by history of what disciplined action under moral restraint can accomplish. The forest where it happened has long since grown quiet. The trenches have collapsed, the guns are gone. What remains is a lesson carried forward across generations, that even in wars defined by machines and mass, the conscience of a single individual can still matter. In the end, Alvin C. York's legacy is not a legend of invincibility, but a reminder of responsibility. That courage is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act despite it. That freedom has often depended on people who never wanted to be heroes, but who stepped forward when circumstance demanded it. That is how a machine gun nest fell silent in the Argonne forest, and that is why the moment still endures.